My wife Clara was clinging to life behind the double doors of the intensive care unit, but the real tragedy was already resting in the palm of my hand. A pale nurse had just slipped past the sterile plastic curtains, offering me a weak, sympathetic nod before pressing Clara's mud-caked, cracked smartphone into my fingers. She whispered something about personal belongings, but her voice was drowned out by the rhythmic, agonizing beep of the heart monitor inside. I stared down at the spiderweb of fractures across the glass screen. It was stained with dirt from the ravine where my heavy SUV had plunged 3 hours ago. My thumbs instinctively wiped at the grime, and that was when the screen flickered to life. A single push notification illuminated the dark cracks. It came from an unsaved number, but the message itself was fully visible on the lock screen. The words did not just shock me, they dismantled my entire reality in a single heartbeat. The text read, "Is it done? Did the brakes fail on the pass? Tell me he is dead, so we can file the estate." I stared at those cold digital letters, reading them once, twice, a dozen times, waiting for my brain to reject the horrific math of the situation. But as a retired forensic accident investigator, my mind does not reject evidence. It processes it. The text was not sent to a grieving spouse. It was sent to a co-conspirator. The sender assumed they were texting Clara after she had successfully executed a plan, but there had been a sudden twist of fate. Last night, Clara had complained that her sedan was making a strange rattling noise, insisting she take my heavy, armored SUV for her late-night drive across the mountain pass. I had kissed her forehead, handed her my keys, and told her to be safe. Now, the chilling truth hit me like a physical blow. The rigged brakes, the sudden vehicle swap, the desperate rush to get me out of the picture. The trap had been set for me. Clara had tried to murder me, only to drive my sabotaged vehicle off the cliff herself. I knew that unsaved number. I did not need a contact name to recognize the arrogant, demanding tone. It belonged to Clara's brother, Julian, a man who had spent the last 5 years drowning in debt while looking down his nose at my quiet lifestyle. He and Clara had always whispered in corners during family dinners, complaining about my supposed frugality, entirely unaware of the massive generational wealth I quietly managed. They saw an aging, simple man, and they wanted to strip me clean. My hands stopped shaking. The grief that had been suffocating me just moments ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. I looked through the glass window at Clara, her face pale, surrounded by tubes and wires, fighting for the life she tried to steal from me. My decades of reconstructing crash scenes taught me one vital rule: never react until you have mapped out the entire trajectory. I quietly slid the cracked phone into my pocket. Julian and Clara wanted a tragedy. I would give them one, but it would not be the one they planned. I did not become a wealthy man by accident, nor did I survive 30 years in the forensic wreckage of other people's worst mistakes by being naive. Yet, staring at that cracked screen in the hospital corridor, I had to accept the bitter truth that the greatest wreck of my life had been quietly engineered right under my own roof. For years, I chose to play the part of the simple, quiet husband, a retired industrial investigator who preferred grease-stained overalls over the hollow glitz of high society. I lived in the sprawling, historic stone estate handed down through 4 generations of my family. But I treated it as a home, not a trophy. Clara and her brother Julian, however, saw my humility as weakness. To them, my silence was just the slow, dull ticking of an old clock they could not wait to smash. The estate itself was a masterpiece of old-world stone, a legacy my grandfather built with sweat and grit. But to Julian, my simple lifestyle was an insult to the wealth I possessed. He was a man drowning in his own bad debts, yet he never missed an opportunity to look down his nose at me. At our family dinners, he would swirl his expensive wine, bought with money he did not have, and make passive-aggressive remarks about my old rugged SUV and my refusal to liquidate my family's historic land trust. Clara would sit beside him, nodding silently, her eyes reflecting a cold, growing resentment. She had married me believing she would step into a life of effortless luxury, only to find that my wealth was anchored in preservation. Lately, her complaints had shifted to a sharp, calculating curiosity. She began asking highly specific questions about the legal structure of the trust, inquiring who would inherit the estate if something unexpected were to happen to me. I brushed it off then, wanting desperately to believe she was just planning for our future. Now the memory of her sweet, probing voice feels like a slow-acting poison. It all culminated on that fateful, rainy evening. Clara had been pacing the hardwood floors of our living room for hours, her eyes darting to her phone every few minutes as if waiting for a signal. When she suddenly announced she had an urgent, late-night charity committee meeting up in the winding mountain pass, my investigator's instinct felt a tiny, quiet tug of suspicion. The roads were notorious for mudslides during downpours, and Clara hated driving in the dark. I told her it was far too dangerous, and she should stay home, but she brushed me off with a nervous, forced laugh. That was when she walked out to the driveway, only to return minutes later, breathless and seemingly panicked, claiming her luxury sedan had a completely flat tire. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside to check it. As I knelt in the gravel, the beam of light caught the damage. The tire was not just flat. The sidewall had been sliced with a clean, deliberate stroke of a sharp blade. Before I could even offer to change the tire, Clara practically grabbed my arm. Her grip was tight, her voice frantic as she insisted she take my heavy, rugged SUV instead. Looking back, her desperation was not about the meeting. She was terrified I would discover the cut on her tire was fresh. She thought she was sending me to my doom on those slippery mountain roads, completely unaware that by snatching my keys, she was stepping directly into the very trap she and Julian had laid for me. The county impound lot was a desolate graveyard of crushed steel, tucked away in an industrial corner of the city. To the yard manager, I was just a grieving husband looking to retrieve a few personal items from the wreckage of his SUV before the insurance company wrote it off. I showed him my forensic investigator badge, which still carried weight, and he gave me a sympathetic nod before pointing toward the far corner of the chain-link enclosure. There, resting under a heavy tarp, was my ruined vehicle. Seeing it folded like paper should have broken me, but my heart was already numb, frozen by the digital betrayal sitting in my pocket. I pulled on my work gloves and walked toward the carcass of my former vehicle. I did not go to the cabin first. Instead, I bypassed it entirely and knelt in the damp, oil-stained gravel beside the rear wheel well. The chassis had collapsed, pinning the front suspension, but the rear of the heavy vehicle was jacked upward by the force of the roll. I slipped onto my back, ignoring the cold mud, and slid myself beneath the rusted underbelly. The smell of transmission fluid was suffocating, a familiar scent from 30 years of piecing together other people's worst nightmares. My fingers, guided by decades of muscle memory, moved past the crumpled exhaust pipe straight to the rear brake lines. I needed to see the metal. Metal never lies. It does not feel greed, and it does not pretend to love you. I located the flexible brake hose near the rear axle, right where it joined the rigid steel tubing. It was caked in thick, greasy road grime. But as my thumb rubbed away the dark paste, my skin caught on a sharp, jagged edge. I pulled my penlight from my pocket and aimed the narrow beam directly at the wound in the steel-braided line. This was no tear from a jagged rock, nor was it the result of extreme tension from the plunge. The braided stainless steel outer sheath had been severed with a single, clean, 45-degree diagonal cut. It was the unmistakable signature of high-tensile steel shears. The cut was precise. It had been made through 3/4 of the line, leaving just enough integrity to hold pressure during normal driving. But the moment Clara applied heavy pressure on the steep mountain descent, the compromised line burst, leaving her helpless. To mask the crime, the saboteur had smeared old grease over the fresh cut to dull the bright shine of newly severed steel. It was a clever, murderous design. But they had forgotten who they were trying to kill. They had tried to use my own professional world against me, entirely unaware that they were leaving a textbook trail of evidence. I took several high-resolution photographs of the cut, ensuring the shear marks were perfectly illuminated. As I slid out from under the cold iron of the wreckage, my grief did not return. It was gone, replaced by a cold, tactical resolve. Clara and Julian wanted to play a game of life and death for my family's legacy. They were about to learn that a quiet man is not a weak man. I stood up, brushed the gravel from my coat, and walked back to my car. The hunt had officially begun. Returning to the empty house we shared felt like entering a tomb designed specifically for me. I did not turn on the overhead lights. Instead, I navigated the dark hallways by memory, guided only by the pale moonlight filtering through the high windows. I made my way directly to Clara's private home office, a room I had rarely entered out of respect for her boundaries. That respect was a luxury I could no longer afford. I sat at her heavy mahogany desk, the leather chair groaning softly under my weight. In the corner of the room, the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock amplified the suffocating silence, each hollow chime sounding like a countdown to my own planned demise. I started with her physical desk, applying the methodical patience of a man who spent his life looking for what others tried to hide. It did not take long. Beneath the false bottom of her stationery drawer, my fingers brushed against a thick manila envelope. I pulled it out and laid it flat on the desk. Inside was a set of legal documents. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the top page. It was a fully executed power of attorney document granting Clara total control over my assets and our historic family estate. At the bottom of the page, my signature was written in bold, black ink. I leaned closer, examining the curves of the letters. It was a highly skilled forgery, but the ink flow was hesitant, showing the unnatural micro-tremors of someone tracing a template. They had prepared everything to seize my life's work. Beneath the forged legal documents lay a series of offshore bank statements under an entity named Crestview Holdings. The account was highly active, boasting a balance that did not align with Clara's modest personal income. I pulled up my own secure laptop to cross-reference the shell company names listed as the primary depositors. Within 20 minutes of digital digging, using the tracing networks I had established during my decades in industrial investigation, the ownership of those shell corporations revealed itself. Every single one of them led back to Julian. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with devastating clinical precision. Julian's arrogant facade of wealth was a complete sham. He was not just struggling, he was deeply in debt to high-interest, dangerous offshore creditors who were closing in on him. Clara had agreed to bail him out. But Julian's debts were far too massive for her to cover with her own savings. They needed my family's multi-million-dollar industrial land trusts. The trust was legally locked, structured to protect our generational legacy from outside parasites. The only way Clara could liquidate those assets was if I was permanently out of the picture, allowing her to inherit the estate and execute the forged power of attorney to bypass the probate court's lengthy delays. I sat back in the dark, listening to the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock. The betrayal was absolute, documented in cold black ink and digital transactions. They did not just want me gone. They had calculated the exact price of my life down to the last decimal point. My wife and her brother had sat across from me at Sunday dinners, smiling and sharing my bread, while quietly planning the mechanics of my execution. They thought my quiet nature meant I was blind. They were about to learn that the most dangerous place to stand is in the blind spot of an investigator who has nothing left to lose. The rhythmic, sterile beep of the heart monitor was the only sound cutting through the heavy silence of the intensive care unit. I sat perfectly still in the deepest corner of the room, where the shadows from the hallway light could not reach me. In the center of that cold, white space lay Clara. Her head was wrapped in thick, white gauze, leaving only her eyes and mouth exposed to the harsh fluorescent glow. For hours, I had watched her chest rise and fall, waiting for the exact moment the sedatives would wear off. I did not move. I simply sat there, a silent observer in the wreckage of the life we had built together, holding her cracked, dirt-stained phone in my coat pocket. When her eyelids finally fluttered open, there was a brief, disorienting moment of confusion. I watched her pupils dilate, searching the ceiling before settling on the empty space beside her bed. I knew what she was expecting to see. She was expecting a weeping doctor, or perhaps her brother Julian holding her hand, gently delivering the tragic news that her husband's heavy SUV had plummeted off the mountain pass. She was expecting to play the role of the devastated, wealthy widow, ready to inherit the sprawling stone estate and the vast land trusts that had protected my family for generations. Instead, I slowly stood up from the darkness. I stepped forward, allowing the cold overhead light to illuminate my face. I was completely unharmed. My clothes were pressed, my hands were clean, and my posture was steady. I stood over her bed, looking down into her swollen, bandaged face with eyes that held no warmth, no anger, only a chilling, absolute certainty. The moment her gaze locked onto mine, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor spiked violently. The machine began to chime in rapid, frantic successions, betraying the terror surging through her veins. Her lips parted, trembling beneath the gauze, but no sound came out. She looked at me as if she were staring at a ghost. The trap had failed, and the man she had tried to kill was standing right in front of her, completely untouched. Before she could find her voice, the heavy wooden door of the room swung open. Julian rushed in, his face twisted into a rehearsed expression of deep, performative sorrow, his eyes cast toward the floor as he began to speak. He was already preparing to comfort his sister when his eyes finally traveled upward and collided with mine. The transformation was instantaneous. The false grief on his face drained away, leaving his skin a sickly, ash-gray color. He froze mid-step, his mouth hanging slightly open, his hand hovering in the air as if paralyzed. The sheer, suffocating panic in the room was almost tangible. I watched his eyes dart from me to his sister, then back to me, his mind desperately scrambling to recalculate a math that no longer added up. I smiled, a slow, polite gesture that did not reach my eyes. I took a step toward Julian, placing a firm, heavy hand on his trembling shoulder. I told him how glad I was that he had arrived so quickly. My voice was calm, steady, and terrifyingly gentle. I looked back at Clara, whose eyes were wide with a helpless, trapped desperation. I told them both not to worry about a single thing. I whispered that while Clara was recovering, I would take it upon myself to handle all of our financial affairs, including her private files, her bank accounts, and the estate planning. I felt Julian's shoulders stiffen beneath my grip, his muscles turning to stone as he realized that the paper trail of their greed was now entirely in my hands. They were trapped in a cage of their own making, and the door had just locked behind them. The air in Clara's private recovery suite was thick with the sterile scent of antiseptic and the heavy, suffocating weight of greed. I sat quietly in the armchair near the window, watching Julian pace the floor, his eyes constantly darting toward the leather briefcase held by his attorney, Victor. Clara lay propped up against her pillows, her pale face framed by medical gauze, her breathing shallow and rapid. She tried to project the image of a fragile victim, but her eyes betrayed her. They were fixed on my longtime attorney, Arthur, who stood silently by the door. I had summoned them all here under the pretense of signing emergency medical funding papers to release millions from my accounts for Clara's rehabilitation. Julian had practically run through the hospital doors to get here, bringing Victor along to ensure they did not miss a single scrap of my wealth. Julian cleared his throat, adjusting his suit jacket, trying to play the part of a concerned brother. He urged me to sign the papers quickly, claiming the medical board required immediate financial guarantees. I looked at him, then at Clara, and finally at Victor, who offered a smooth, rehearsed nod. They thought this was the moment they finally cracked open my family's vault. They thought the simple, quiet husband was about to hand over the keys to his legacy. I stood up slowly, the movement deliberate, and entirely devoid of the grief they expected. Instead of picking up Arthur's pen, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small remote control. I pointed it at the smart monitor mounted on the wall opposite Clara's bed. With a single click, the screen flickered to life, bathing the white room in a cold, unforgiving light. Projected on the screen was a macro photograph of a severed braided steel line. The clean, 45-degree diagonal cut through the metal was unmistakable. Next to it, I displayed the digital forensic report of the unread text message from Clara's phone. The words, "Is it done? Did the brakes fail on the pass?" filled the screen in damning letters. Before they could gasp, I clicked the remote again, revealing the financial ledger of Crestview Holdings, detailing the offshore transactions linking Julian's debts directly to Clara's secret accounts. The silence in the room became absolute, broken only by the frantic beeping of Clara's heart monitor. Victor went pale, slowly stepping away from his client. Julian's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The arrogant facade of the wealthy social climber had completely shattered, leaving only a terrified, cornered animal. I leaned against the foot of Clara's bed, looking down at them with the formidable authority of a man who had spent his life analyzing wreckage. I explained that my family's wealth was secured in an ironclad, generation-skipping trust they could never touch. I then looked Julian directly in the eye and laid out their only choices. They could either sign a full, notarized confession to the attempted murder charges, resulting in a quiet, complete surrender of all marital assets and a lifetime of ruin, or face immediate arrest. I took the heavy leather folder containing the surrender agreements from Arthur's hands and tossed it onto the bedside table. The heavy leather folder hit the wood with a sharp, resounding thud that echoed through the silent room, like the final strike of a judge's gavel. The silence that followed the heavy thud of those folders was the quietest moment of my entire life. Victor, the slick lawyer who had thought himself so clever, was the first to break under the pressure. When the police officers I had prearranged with Arthur stepped into the sterile hospital room, Victor did not even attempt to argue his way out. He simply held out his wrists, his expensive silver watch catching the harsh fluorescent light as the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around him. I watched him being led away, his head bowed, his tailored suit suddenly looking like nothing more than a cheap, ill-fitting disguise. Julian could only stare at his own hands, trembling, realizing that the gilded cage he had tried to build for me had locked him inside instead. His sister Clara lay in the hospital bed, physically broken from the crash she had engineered for me, stripped of every cent of the wealth she had coveted, and now officially remanded to custody, destined to await her trial in a secure medical detention facility. I left them behind in that sterile, white fortress of consequences and drove back to my ancestral estate. The long, winding driveway of gravel and earth welcomed me back. The ancient stone walls of my grandfather's house standing tall and firm against the grey afternoon sky. I did not go inside immediately. Instead, I stepped out of my car and walked into the quiet, rain-drenched gardens that had belonged to my family for over a century. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth, pine needles, and the deep, silent relief of a storm that had finally passed. As I walked along the stone paths I had trodden since I was a boy, I looked at the old oak trees, their roots dug deep into the soil. I thought about the sheer, exhausting weight of their greed. Julian and Clara had spent years of their lives plotting, whispering, and forging documents, all to steal what they could have simply respected. They wanted the prize without ever understanding the labor that made it sacred. They saw my simple clothes, my grease-stained hands, and my quiet life as signs of weakness, entirely blind to the truth that real strength does not need to shout. It does not need to wear expensive watches or drive luxury vehicles to feel worthy. The soft, steady patter of the rain began to fall around me, washing away the lingering tension in my shoulders. I felt a profound sadness for Clara, not because she had failed, but because she had thrown away a lifetime of genuine devotion for a hollow illusion of luxury. My trust in love, in the warmth of a shared home, had been shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, much like the windshield of my ruined vehicle. It would take a long time to heal from the realization that the woman I shared my bed with wanted me dead. But as I stood under the canopy of the old oaks, letting the gentle rain wet my face, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My integrity was entirely intact. The legacy my grandfather built and the honor I had carried through my own long career remained clean and untouched. I had not stooped to their level of malice. I had simply shone a light on their darkness, using the truth as my only weapon. The storm had cleared the air, leaving me with a clean slate, a quiet heart, and the enduring peace of an honest life.